Prior to 1977, if you wanted the top-of-the-line four-door vehicle from either Cadillac or Lincoln, you were getting a very large car. Over at Cadillac, if you wanted the top-of-the-line at that point that was not a coupe or a convertible, you'd be buying the Fleetwood Brougham, which rode atop a 133-inch wheelbase, 3 inches longer than the Calais or the DeVille series, and 7 inches longer than the Eldorado. That was a huge car, and it had in 1976 a base price of $10,935, which is about the equivalent of roughly $70,000 today. So it was extremely expensive. Now, over at Lincoln, if you were not getting a top-of-the-line coupe, which would have been the Mark IV in 1976, you were buying the Continental four-door, which rode atop a 127-inch wheelbase and had a base price of about $9,300, the equivalent of about $65,000 today. So again, another expensive vehicle and huge and massive. But for 1977, both Cadillac and Lincoln, for the first time, had their range-topping automobiles as small vehicles. For Cadillac, it was the Seville, which rode atop just a 114-inch wheelbase at that period of time. And over at Lincoln, this would be the inaugural year for the Versailles, which rode atop a 110-inch wheelbase and really was the response to Cadillac coming out with the Seville in 1976. I should say partway through 1975 for the 1976 model year. So today we're going to compare the Cadillac Seville from 1977 with the Lincoln Versailles for 1977 and see, well, which is better for that particular year. Let's get started. Now, as I previously mentioned, Cadillac would introduce its all-new Seville for the 1976 model year, and you can see it here. The 76 would differ in a few ways versus the 1977 model, but the most, I'll say, obvious way is the front grille, which here on the 1976 model and 1976 only has this egg crate texture. It'd go to a more vertical texture in 1977 and stay all that way through the end of the model run of the first generation Seville, which ended in 1979. When it was introduced in 1976, the Seville had a base price of about $12,500. It was extremely expensive. It's about the equivalent of $73,000 today. That's the base price of that vehicle. There weren't all that many options. It did come standard with automatic climate control, for instance, power windows, power locks. You could get, as an example, an optional 6-way power seat and recliner on the passenger side, as well as other options. But in general, it was expensive to begin with, and the car amazingly turned out to be a hit. Now, you have to remember that this car was really pioneering in that bigger often meant more expensive for luxury cars, and here smaller was more expensive. And so the Seville actually started its life as a vehicle that you see here called the LaSalle. Cadillac was thinking of introducing a lower-end nameplate that was smaller and cheaper. But when the particular vehicle shown here clinicked so successfully, customers thought, as an example, it was a competitor to a super expensive Mercedes-Benz. Cadillac realized that it could actually charge more for the car than less. And that really set the direction for the Seville in terms of its pricing strategy. Again, it was originally thought and conceived to be a lower-end vehicle. You can also see the styling of the final car differs significantly from the LaSalle prototype that you see here, and there's a number of reasons for that. This LaSalle prototype was done in the studio that was headed by an individual named Wayne Cady, who would later design the Busselback Seville. He would come back to Cadillac, but Wayne would be a chief designer of one of the Cadillac studios in the early 1970s. He would then depart, and Stan Weiland would take over. Stan Weiland would come from Oldsmobile Studio, where he'd done the 66 Tornado, and become the Cadillac studio leader. And Stan would develop a proposal for a new, smaller Cadillac called the La Scala. Now, this model that you see here was actually done before the, I'll call it, more fastbacky proposal for the LaSalle that you previously saw. So the car started with this kind of a design, and then it went to the previous photo that I showed you, and then it ended with the final production variant. Here, this is a pretty sporty car with a very low hood line. Look at how low the hood comes at the front of the vehicle. But you can see elements of the 76 Seville here, that egg crate grille texture, those quad headlamps, and the kind of sheer look styling that would end up on the 1976 Seville. I think in the background on the right there is this particular rendering done by John Gable that inspired the La Scala. Now just think for a moment how revolutionary this particular sketch is in the context of the early 1970s. This looks like no other American car out there. Super low hood line, very glassy upper, thin roof, just a gorgeous design. And I have to give it to the designers. They really did stretch their imagination with this. Now, between the Stan Weiland proposals that you saw here, then the Wayne Cady proposal, the design studio in Cadillac went back to Stan Parker, who headed Cadillac Studio back during the 1967 Eldorado's development, and he and the team came up with the final Seville that you see here. Now, this particular 76 Seville would have a minor evolution into the 1977 variant. I mentioned before the front end was really what was different with the grille. Notice the Cadillac script is no longer over top of the driver's side headlights. It's integrated into that cap over top of the grille. But the car here clearly has a bit more formal, less sporty proportions than that La Scala proposal that really started the design direction for this particular variant of the Seville. But you can see it has the same wheel arches, has kind of the same front end, but a much more vertical C-pillar in particular, more upright A-pillar, more greenhouse area, daylight opening up top. And, you know, this car was meant to be a formal vehicle. So I suspect one of the things that happened is when the original clinics were happening with respect to the car, Cadillac determined that it could also push it up market, and maybe it gave it a bit more formal styling to coincide with that. The other thing I'll say about the Seville is it was designed in a very rapid time period, I think less than a year from the overall start of this particular design to finish. And that was, let's just say, revolutionary by the time standards of the benchmark time of the era. Normally designers would have a couple of years to do something like this, but not in this car. This car didn't even make it outside to the design patio until it was done, which was very rare. Often designers would take the cars out and walk around them. Not so with this car. Done all in the studio, shipped outside. The designers were thankful that it looked pretty good, and that was it, released for production. Now, despite the rush job from a design perspective, the car is, let's just say, I would say inarguably elegantly proportioned. Take a look at the dash to axle on this car. It's fantastic. The front wheel is pushed far forward, way ahead of the A-pillar and very close to the bumper. That was pretty revolutionary for the time. Normally you had pretty large front overhangs, but not so on this car. And you can see the very vertical style C-pillar, the beautiful just kind of flat belt line, but it also tapers very slightly front and rear, something that Ford didn't do. Ford would rarely kind of taper their vehicles like that. And I think the side profile is one of the strongest and the best. And perhaps it's because designers often start with the side profile and do full-size tape renderings, at least back in this time they did, with the side profile, and they spend the most time on it. And I think this car just looks fantastic in side view. That vertical C-pillar goes well. This car really pioneered a whole new look for General Motors design at the time, the so-called sheer look, as it was called. It would be copied not only when the 1977 Caprice and full-size vehicles were introduced, but be copied by everybody. It was even copied by Ford when the Panther platform cars would come out. Chrysler copied it on numerous vehicles too. So it really did set an entirely new direction from a design perspective. Maybe one area where the Seville wasn't quite as elegant was this rear three-quarter view. It's not bad, but the tail lamps look pretty small, and that vertical distance, the height of the deck lid, it just looks like it needs a little bit more height. The Cadillac logo, the wreath and crest, looks like it's squeezed in there, just barely above the license plate. But then if you do that, you're obviously changing the profile and side view. And I think this was a reasonable compromise. It looks fine. The interesting thing here is that the tail lamps, while Cadillac often had and almost always had vertical tail lamps after 1948, These are kind of vertical, but they're more like blocks. And that was not what Cadillac often had. There's no real fin here. This is more almost like an Oldsmobile-style taillight. Oldsmobile taillights were very functional and blocky often. That was their design signature. And maybe it's, let's say, in keeping with some parts of the Seville, because under hood, Cadillac got something from Oldsmobile that we're going to talk about in a second. Now, inside your Seville for 1977, you did get a pretty luxurious place. But Cadillac materials on the inside weren't all that great during this time frame. The dash was, I'll call it somewhat soft touch material. It just wasn't all that high quality. The wood grain is fake, as it would be in the Versailles as well. The door panels would be extremely well padded. The armrest, the upper, the lower would be carpeted. You can see there in the passenger door the little puddle light there integrated into the underside of the armrest. The seats were, I would say, rather comfortable, but the car feels a bit overstuffed if you're sitting in one. The seats are relatively puffy, the door panels are puffy, and the footwell is not all that wide because this really is a Chevy Nova that's been stretched, and a lot of work was done to this Chevy Nova chassis to make it rather refined. It does still have the leaf springs out back. It is still a unibody car with subframes, front and rear. It is not a full-frame car. But I will say to call it just a gussied up Nova isn't really fair. If you drive one of these Sevilles, they are very quiet on the inside. They drive quite refined as well. Maybe not as refined as some of the larger Cadillacs, but they don't jiggle. They handle quite well. I would say the ride is actually very good for the time frame. And in this particular photo, you can get a little bit more of a sense of how overstuffed the interior is. Take a look at those seats and how puffy they are. It intruded on rear leg room, something that Cadillac would learn in later generations. But, overall, you had pretty good interior materials in here, just not, I would say, something that was befitting of a car that cost $75,000 almost in terms of today's dollars, a base price. Did get a nice woven headliner, but that was typical for the time frame. So nice, but maybe not as nice as it could have been. Now, I did allude to Cadillac getting something from Oldsmobile, and Cadillac actually sourced the Oldsmobile 350 cubic inch V8 to go under hood in the 1976 to 79 Seville. The Cadillac engine was a big block. Cadillac didn't have a small block V8 at this time. They just had the 500 cubic incher, and it could not be shoehorned under hood here. And so they went with the Oldsmobile 350 small block engine, which you can see is shoehorned in here. Now, it wasn't something that was available on Oldsmobiles because Cadillac would put a Rochester Bendix fuel injection setup atop the Oldsmobile V8, an exclusive that you couldn't get in an Oldsmobile. And it was actually a pretty sophisticated setup. It was a multi-port setup with an electronic control module. This was not mechanical fuel injection like some of the Bosch setups. And it did pretty well. The car made 180 horsepower as a result. And if you've driven one of these when they're in good tune, wow, do they run smoothly and quietly. You almost key the starter not knowing that the engine is running. So this really was an engine befitting of a luxury car. It had good throttle response. It wasn't super fast, probably about an 11-second 0 to 60 car, but good for the time and very, very refined. That is for certain. Speaking of refinement, take a look underneath here. One of the things that Cadillac did to really improve the road shock isolation when you're driving the vehicle and make sure that those shocks don't make it through the steering wheel is add a shock, in fact. You can see it here kind of tagged along to the drag link, the center link there of the steering. And I don't know how effective this is. You certainly get the road shock and the shock coming through the control arms and up through the suspension. But at least it did help isolate the steering from various jolts and jars on the road. And I suppose it worked. Cadillac used this on other vehicles. But I have to say, I never really have driven a General Motors car, whether it's a Chevy or a Cadillac of the 1970s, and felt, my goodness, I feel like I get too much feedback in the steering wheel. So I guess regardless, Cadillac felt it was something that was needed on this car. And just an example of the care that they put into refining this Nova chassis and using things like fast Fourier analysis to try to isolate the car from the road. Now, over at Lincoln, they were watching the success of the 1976 Cadillac Seville, which actually ended up selling 44,000 units in the 1976 model year. As I mentioned, it was a bit of an elongated model year, but still, that was a runaway success, especially when you consider that the Eldorado Coupe, as an example, was selling about 35,000 units. The Fleetwood Brougham, 24,500 units. So the car was unquestionably successful. So Lincoln certainly wanted a piece of the action, and they decided to introduce the Versailles for 1977, which was based on the Granada platform. Yes, I said that right. This is effectively a Granada and a Monarch. But just like Cadillac started with plebeian beginnings and then Chevrolet Nova for the Seville, so too did Lincoln with the Versailles, and they did a lot to really refine it. Now, the Versailles for 1977 did start out with a lower base price than the Seville. It had a base price of $11,500, and that was, by this point, about $1,500 to $2,000 cheaper than the Cadillac Seville. Despite that, by the way, the Versailles would not enjoy the same success as the Seville, selling only 15,000 units in its inaugural model year. But the Versailles, as I mentioned, was based on the Granada and Monarch, and you can certainly see it in the roofline. Lincoln designers did try to give the car a very Lincoln-esque front end and hood and grille up front. One thing you have up here are exposed wipers as well, something that you wouldn't have on the Cadillac Seville, and they look a little tacky. I don't know why Lincoln chose to have them painted black, probably to try to hide them, but I think it actually makes them look worse. I would have just finished them in bright work and embraced the fact that they were exposed wipers. Now, out back is where you really see the Granada and Monarch in terms of the roofline, although I have to give Lincoln credit. They did try to kind of give the Versailles in its inaugural year these little flying buttresses, I guess, and kind of push the rear glass further down so that it's inset. I don't know that it was all that successful, and I think designers didn't necessarily think it was successful because they would redo the roofline for the 1979 model year and get a fiberglass cap from American Sunroof that they would put over top of the sheet metal, and then a vinyl top would kind of disguise it and gave it more of a vertical style rear C-pillar a la Cadillac Seville. Now, you do have some Lincoln SQs, just like the front. You did get the unique deck lid with the faux spare tire trunk hump, as you can see there. And the fuel filler door, interestingly, integrated into that spare tire hump. Now, this design is not as happy of a design as the Cadillac Seville. I don't think it broke any new ground in terms of what it was trying to do. You notice the very flat fender profile as well that I've previously mentioned was a trademark of Ford, as well as the flat quarter profile. And I think it's not a horrible looking car, but it's not the car and the design statement that the Seville really was at the time. Now, I haven't really seen many sketches or design proposals of the original Versailles. There's some floating around for what was supposed to be the second generation that was a stillborn car. But here's one from Homer Lagasse before the car was called the Versailles. I can't quite read the lettering on the deck lid there, the kind of faux tire hump, something that ends in ADA. Maybe it was the Verada. It wasn't Versailles. In any case, you can see the very crisp edges that this vehicle has. I like the integrated exhaust there into the lower portion of the bumper. But that was not what the Versailles ended up being. It ended up being a little bit more doughy, I guess, than this particular proposal. Now, inside your Versailles, you also got, kind of similar to the Seville, a bit of an overstuffed interior. Look at how thick the door panel is. And the seats, here you got bucket seats as opposed to the, I guess I'll call it kind of a split bench in the Seville. Wasn't really a bench, wasn't really a bucket. But here you got a center console standard with a very small armrest. The Seville at least gave you an individual armrest for each seat. Here you had to share your armrest with the passenger. So the Versailles was, I would say, pretty luxurious on the inside. The carpet there was super plush and thick, as was true in the Seville. One of the things about the Versailles, you can't quite see it, but the brake pedal says disc brakes. Hot rodders love the Versailles for the Ford 9-inch rear end with disc brakes on the rear. And unfortunately, that's one of the things that has caused relatively few survivors in terms of the Versailles because many hot rodders want that rear end. It's a pretty prized item. And, oh well, it's something that kind of banishes these to often the junkyard because people want various components associated with them. They probably don't want those coach lights. The medieval style coach lights on the B pillar in this, I think, are just, terrible. But, well, that's just my eye. Now, under hood is where the Versailles fell down in a number of places. In 1977, the only engine that was available in the Versailles was a 351 cubic inch Ford V8 topped by a 2-barrel carburetor. So you didn't get fuel injection here. And unfortunately, it didn't make anywhere near the horsepower that the Seville did. It made just 135 horsepower compared to the Seville's 180. Unless you were in California, in which case you had to get the 302 under hood, which made 133 horsepower. Not much difference. And perhaps that's the reason why after the 1977 model year, all the Versailles had the 302 under hood. So this was really a letdown, I would say. Not a bad engine. The 351 was a good engine, but it just wasn't the same refined power plant that was under hood in the Seville. Now, despite that, notice the GM-style A6 air conditioning compressor that was sourced from General Motors, but under hood, you see quite a few elements of refinement here in terms of what Ford was doing. Take a look at those shocks, and those are so-called double isolated shocks. You have the shock itself that is isolated, and then the mount is isolated with various rubber bushings. That was something that I think was first done on the Versailles. The Versailles was also the first car to have clear coat paint and the first car with halogen headlamps. So you did get some really great innovative features. And I have to say, take a look at that extremely sturdy bracket that is bolted to the air conditioning compressor bracket. I have to imagine that Ford did that to really stabilize it and to help minimize vibration because the air conditioning compressor on these with the automatic climate control was running almost all the time except in cold weather. And I haven't seen that in any other car, including the Cadillac Seville, which used the same style air conditioning compressor. But my guess is Ford just really wanted to minimize the vibration, and that's why they did the double isolated shocks, that extreme, let's say, bracing for the air conditioning compressor, and some other things too. Now, that bracing on the air conditioning compressor could also be found on the Granada, but the dual isolated shock mounts were not. The other thing that was not found on the Granada was this little bracing in between the fenders and the radiator support. That was something that Lincoln added, I guess, for enhanced structural rigidity. So number of things that were different on this versus the Granada as well as the Monarch. So which car would I have picked back in 1977? I have to go with the Seville. The car was just beautiful and elegant and a trendsetter in terms of the styling. Maybe from a ride perspective, I'd give that to the Versailles, to be candid. I think the Versailles, having ridden in them, actually ride better and they have better road isolation. But I just can't get over some of the looks of the Versailles. It just doesn't quite have the curb appeal to me that the Seville does. You pull up in the Seville, and while it's small, it certainly has a presence. And that's one thing that I don't really think is true of the Versailles. It's got a presence, but it's just not overly stately. It looks like a downsized Lincoln that doesn't necessarily fit the proportions of the smaller body. But this Seville, just particularly in the side profile, I think looks so elegant and beautiful. So that would have been my choice. And of course, under hood, as I mentioned, I would have loved the 180 horsepower Oldsmobile 350 as opposed to the 351 carbureted variant in the Versailles. I just don't think that that was a shrewd move on Lincoln's part. Maybe one of the reasons why they also had a significantly lower base price. But if you're going to have an upper-end car, you might as well go all the way. And I think that was one of the things that made the Seville great. What do you think? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. And do you like this format? Thanks again for watching.